Okay, so as a storyteller, one of my concerns is being, sort of part of the atheist, skeptic, humanist community. We don't have stories. Because we have spent so much of our time as sort of a collective community, particularly in North America and in parts of Europe, attacking the Jesus myth. Myth itself has become a pejorative, and so we dismiss it. We're not going to talk about Heracles or Thor or any other mythological supernatural story, because from the collective sort of point of view, it's either true, literally, or it's not true, literally. And if it's not true, kick it to the curb. Why are we going to waste our time? It's a bunch of silliness. The unfortunate side effect of that, I think, is, as I started at the beginning, we have no stories. We don't communicate what we want to see in society or what we think is value about society. We don't communicate issues of ethics and justice and politics and even science, maybe, in any way other than kind of in cold, hard facts. And you don't motivate people that way. You just don't. The flip side of that is that we actually fail to understand religion because we don't understand the mythology that permeates our culture, because we dismiss mythology and storytelling as something mushy-headed, something that's not all that interesting. And we fail to understand why a Francis Collins buys into Christianity at all, because we don't even understand really as a group what people believed before the Christians showed up. And then when they showed up, why did everybody buy into it, and why do they still buy into it? The reasons haven't changed, I assure you. So prior to the advent of sort of the Christian era, the dominant mythology of the West, or the dominant religion of the West, and by the way, the only difference between myth and religion is that religion is just mythology taken literally, ritualized, and institutionalized. You strip those other two things away, what you've got are very, very cool stories that are very malleable and you can do lots of things with. The mythological belief or the religious belief prior to the Christian era was a drastically different thing than what we have now. First of all, it wasn't centralized around any particular central dogma or ideology. But what's most interesting to me is that the gods of Olympus, and then I'm also going to talk about the Norse gods kind of up north a little bit in Europe and Scandinavia, they're just remarkably human. They look like us. They talk like us. They have our foibles. They have our weaknesses. They have our passions. They're just like us. And that's what made the story so compelling, because at the end of the day, Greek and Norse myth was about human life, about the profundity of it, about the sexuality of it, about the ridiculousness of it, about the tragedy of it. And there wasn't any big concern about the hereafter, because everybody went to the same place. There was no concept of reward or punishment. There was no concept of if you just believed the right way, you'd get to hang out in, Hef's jacuzzi in the sky for a while. It was just where everybody went. So what mattered was in the here and now, which is why all of those mythological stories were about us. It was about how human beings cope. Now, yes, some of it was about trying to explain volcanoes and earthquakes and storms and all that kind of thing. But ultimately, these stories were about kind of getting along as human beings, talking about issues of justice and ethics and politics. And in particular, there is the focus on the hero figure. The ancient hero was not Superman. He may have superhuman powers, depending on who you're talking about. But he was a doer of great deeds, sometimes for the benefit of other people, usually for the benefit of his own greater glory. Hercules, as he's known by the copyright-violating Romans. Odysseus, or Ulysses. Achilles. Perseus, right? Theseus. These are all, for the most part, with the exception of Odysseus, who is not divine in any sense. They're all half divine, half human. Sound familiar at all for something that comes later? But they all had these remarkable abilities, and that's what made them heroes. So you could go out and slay a monster, or you could, in the case of Heracles, kind of, wipe out an entire civilization of warrior women, which we think was pretty awful by today's standards. And you're still a hero. You can actually do despicable things in this context and still be a hero because you're the doer of great things. In Norse mythology, it's much the same. The only reward you would get after death is if you died bravely in battle enough that you didn't have to go to unspeakably boring hell. You got to go hang out with the boozers and drinkers and brawlers in Valhalla. But what this meant was, if you're in a society where that's your ideal, well, how many people can even hope to live up to that? In cultures that have high infant mortality, high adult mortality, low literacy, people today, the Occupy movement run around and talk about the tragedy of wealth distribution. Try living 2,000 years ago. Along comes the Christians. And they have two things going for them when they're telling this story. The first is you get to go someplace nice when you die, provided you do all the right rituals and the right prayers, and you do what the priests tell you to do, and so on and so forth. But the other one was, who inherits the earth in Christian mythology? The meek, the sick, the stupid, the poor, the downtrodden. And in fact, the New Testament spends a lot of time telling us that the rich, the strong, the wealthy, and the smart are just, it's game over for them when the end comes. It doesn't matter how smart you are, right? You're going down the tubes. You got to imagine this has a tremendous appeal to your average person because their lives basically suck. And here is somebody for the first time saying it doesn't matter if your life sucks because human life is really not worth anything. It's just dress rehearsal for what comes later. So this is a massive appeal to people. And the stories that Christians have told ever since all revolve around this idea that you don't have to be strong, you don't have to be smart, you don't have to achieve. You actually don't have to do much of anything. Your circumstances are awful. All you have to do is believe and you get some kind of reward. So it's not that difficult to understand in that context why Christianity is so popular and has maintained that way. And when we talk about the Jesus myth, we actually miss the point entirely. The reason that that writers, filmmakers, poets still talk about Heracles, still talk about the Trojan War, still talk about Thor, is because those things connect to us on a very deep, almost emotional level. These are stories about courage, they're stories about sacrifice, they're stories about living through hard times, they're stories about trying to figure out how do you get along, how should women be treated in society, how should we relate to our governments. That's what these stories are all about. It's very visceral stuff. But because they're attached to defunct religions, we tend to ignore them. And so what I'm trying to suggest to you is that if as a community there's any aim that you want to get, if there's anything you want the public to accept, if there's an idea that you want them to understand, you have to stop aping sort of religious evangelism and handing out pamphlets or just laying the facts out and hoping people will get it. If you want to convince people of something, you can't just bash them on the head with it and say, accept these facts or don't. Right? The religious have almost never done that, have they? Right? They always have stories to tell. The great thinkers and philosophers of history who've always wanted to convince you of something, like Plato didn't just come out and go, here's what justice is, accept it or not. He creates an entire mythological world. In the case of his most famous dialogue, The Republic, right? He creates a utopia that's run by philosopher kings, and here's how the society works. And it's in that context you can begin to discuss big ideas. In the New Testament, how does Jesus usually talk to people? What's the method he uses to tell people stories? Parables, exactly. What connects to people are stories about things that they can kind of get their teeth into, right? Which is why The Republic works so well, which is why, although the film was not great, His Dark Materials, The Golden Compass, and those stories work really well. It's why Lord of the Rings works really well. Tolkien set out to write a modern British mythology because he felt, well, we just don't have one. And he borrowed from the Bible, he borrowed from Norse mythology, he borrowed from Greek mythology, he borrowed from all these different sources, just like the Christians did, just like the Greeks did, just like the Norse did, and cobbled together this very compelling story. You know, Hitchens and Dawkins and Dennett and Bertrand Russell and Epicurus and all of these guys who have done that kind of talk before, they've done the job. We don't need to keep doing it. We don't need to reinvent the wheel, right? That job has been done. We can recycle their arguments as necessary. But what we're not doing is communicating some of the bigger ideas of humanism, of secularism, of secular humanism, how this stuff gets blended together now. I mean, one of the major preoccupations for religious people is, you know, where do morals come from? Where do ethics come from? How can you live a good life if you don't think the boss is waiting to kick you down to the basement because you took a cookie out of the cookie jar or something, right? Now we can say, oh, that's just so silly. There's no imaginary man up in the sky. You'd be surprised how little traction that can get you when you talk to the religious. Ultimately, people need stories and examples that speak to them on some level.